Good morning, everyone. This is Dr. Acker with Lecture 5 for NSCI 306. We're talking today about rhetorical appeals. This is designed to help you complete the exercise on asking for money, which is a good application of how to manipulate people for fun and hopefully some profit, as well as to prepare you for our discussion of the Ben Goldacre reading. So this will be a relatively short lecture, just want to kind of give you some definitions and some tools to supplement that work. And then we will meet on Zoom to apply those a little bit later. Let me go ahead and switch over to our lecture notes. So I thought this was actually a pretty good indication of how the main rhetorical appeals work. And I'll go over the details of these a little bit later, but it helps to connect them to techniques or characters that we know. So here we have, of course, the Harry Potter leads. For logos, focus on logic or reason. We have Hermione Granger, who is always about doing the research and figuring out how things ought to work structurally and logically. How do they hold together? You can say we're saying it's Leviosa, Leviosa. For pathos or emotion, we have Ron Weasley, who maybe doesn't think or study quite as well as either Harry or Hermione, but he's dedicated to the cause. He's always there, kind of rushing in, showing that passion. And of course, our hero for Ethos is Harry, always the boy who lived, the hero of the story, always showing that moral goodness and being on the right side of just about everything. And yes, I have read many papers comparing Harry and Voldemort to Jesus and Satan, respectively. But that's another class for another time. The way I want to approach today's class is to look at how rhetoric can help us understand persuasion. In one sense, rhetoric is sort of the science of persuasion, and specifically how the rhetorical appeals, at least the main ones in classical rhetoric, can give us some tools for doing that. This is a very useful way to analyze arguments. And even if you find that your argument or your author mostly focuses on one particular appeal, it's useful to think about how they might work together. So I'm going to be kind of alluding to that as we go. And I want to finish up today by showing you how this works in a particular example of science writing. And we'll come back to some of those questions as well in our discussion of Goldacre. So this particular model of rhetoric, and there are lots of them out there, is classical. It goes back to the ancient Greeks, and I'm using the definition from Aristotle here, that rhetoric is using all the available means of persuasion to make a successful argument. So in Aristotle's book on rhetoric, he goes through all these different techniques for like finding examples to argue about, for delivering your speech, because in his time, rhetoric was pretty much in a spoken exercise. You make speeches in the, not exactly the Colosseum, now I'm not going to remember the term, but you make speeches to your fellow citizens in Athens, and they decide whether to grant your request. Amphitheater, there's the word. Okay, next point, now that I remembered my vocabulary. As I've said before, a lot of arguments require rhetorical choices. So I mentioned in my very first lecture that little mailer about preventing coronavirus, and I pointed out that it was not just about giving you techniques like washing your hands or not going outside, but it was branded. It made certain rhetorical choices about saying, this is advice from President Trump from the White House. And that made a difference in how the argument was presented. So if you're stuck on trying to analyze something rhetorically, you have lots of variables to choose from. You don't just have to say which of the 4 or 3 or whatever, how many appeals you're looking at does this use. You can think of how is that put together. Some of these may depend a lot on the specific setting in which you argue. I'll get to that a little bit more later. And some of them, actually a lot of them will have to change depending on what has changed in that context and the way in which you're making those arguments. So I want to focus on main rhetorical appeals of ethos, logos, pathos, and kairos today. I'll go over each of those in turn a little bit later in the lecture. But this is as much about execution, how you make the argument, as it is about content, what it is you argue. And both of those are fair game when you're analyzing how something works. If you've ever had to do, a speech or a presentation in class, you know that it's a lot more difficult than just sitting there or standing there even and reading from a script, figuring out what it is that you want to say to your audience. Because you have to keep in mind who's listening, how they're responding to you, and how you're going to use that to kind of alter your argument on the fly. This is, of course, one big adjustment we have in going from synchronous live classes to online lectures like this one, is I can't actually see you. So while you're watching this video, you might actually be rolling your eyes or falling asleep or doing both. And I don't have that feedback in the way that I would in a regular classroom. So I might have to make adjustments differently and figure out what's the best way to execute my argument in these lectures. Here's the overall model for rhetorical analysis. And you'll find this especially helpful in the response papers. It helps to start by identifying what techniques are in play. That might be this person is using pathos a lot. But don't stop there. I do see some early drafts and their working thesis is something like, look, there's pathos. And I go back to my favorite question, okay, so what? So you want to push that further and you want to form your argument based on how those techniques work, because often they're combined with multiple appeals, maybe multiple kinds of examples. And more importantly, why are they significant to understanding the text? So what sort of argument do you see? Observation. How does that work? Claim. And why is that important? Your argument and ultimately your difference, back to our model of thesis statements. A big part of this is figuring out why an argument is being made. And this is probably it's one of the more central parts of establishing the rhetorical context, but it can also be kind of a tricky part because you might have different purposes for different arguments at different times. And you're always going to have multiple purposes kind of interacted with each other. When you are writing a paper, for example, part of your job will be to show that you have mastered the material. So when you wrote response paper 1, you need to show, hey, I've read Jared Diamond's essay, Easter's End. I know what he's talking about. I understand his argument. I know something a little more advanced about his techniques. But since this is a writing class, you're also demonstrating a set of skills. So you are trying to persuade me of your argument while showing me that you are competent in some way to make that kind of argument, writing that kind of paper. Likewise, when I give you feedback, I'm giving it on both of those purposes. How well do you express the content as well as how well do you present your argument in writing? So it helps to figure out what you're trying to do, and notice that it may be more than one thing at once here. I recommend starting with your goal, because the purpose of an argument is to spur your audience on to action, to think, to act, to believe differently at the end, maybe to feel something differently even. We'll get into pathos a little bit later. And to accomplish that, it's with some elements of your argument. So start with, what do you want your audience to do? Fill in that second blank first. In order for my audience to feel angry about this story, I need to manipulate the facts of the situation of the framing in this way. I need to use these words. I need to use these images. So your purpose will be driven by your goals. Kind of work backwards through this. You also want to consider what instructions you have. Now, in an academic setting, these are usually, hopefully, straightforward or at least specific. I give you instructions on each of your assignments, each of your papers, but maybe there is room to use different techniques within those instructions. More than once, even when I was a student, I would go to my professor and say, hey, this is something I'm thinking about doing for this paper. Would that be okay? And I get similar emails from my students now. So obviously you want to make sure you check all the boxes here. This is why I include rubrics for the major assignments, as well as instructions. And your ultimate goal is to pull both of these together. So you want to achieve your goal within the limits that you have. And in an academic setting, that might be you want to get an A on the paper, and so you make sure you include all this content, you triple check your writing so there are no typos, stuff like that. But you can also think of it in other rhetorical contexts. If you've ever had a job in retail, especially sales, you know that you have certain limits, and that might be just a time limit. You've got 30 seconds to interact with this customer and convince them to buy this add-on or to order this extra thing or to upgrade from item X to item new and improved X+1. And so your job is to figure out the best way to do that. And it's not just going to be telling them all about the product. It's going to be picking up on cues. What do they want? How are they approaching this project? What is their budget? What is their attitude towards this? Even what is their state of mind right now? If you got the really irate customer or the one who's really in a rush or the one who doesn't really know what they're doing, that's going to call for different techniques. And that's where the sales savvy kind of comes in there. The other big variable here is, of course, your audience. And you are practicing this with your exercise, figuring out which audience to ask for money. The basic idea here is that the better you know who you're talking to or writing to or producing a film for or singing to or whatever it is, the more you can fine-tune your rhetorical choices to reach them more effectively. This is a key element of marketing. There's a certain group, kind of your ideal customer base, and you want to reach them as well as you possibly can. You want to say, this is exactly the kind of need you have or problem you have that we can solve, and we're going to show you exactly how that's going to work. And then there's going to be a larger group that has no particular interest in your product or your service. And part of your job is to say, that's okay. This is not for you. This is why we get ads on our Facebook news feeds and on Twitter and commercials and everything that don't really apply to us, even at all. But somebody decided that it's worth the risk. Maybe we meet part of the requirements. Maybe people who tend to watch this show or watch TV at this time or click on these Facebook pages probably care about this. Maybe they're just pulling something in from your search results or your Alexa history or whatever it is. So as your audiences get more complex, your messages have to do the same thing. Your audiences are humans. Humans are messy. And so we're going to have different priorities and multiple priorities at once. The best messages will meet all of those goals as we go. I'd like this quote from Samuel Johnson from the 18th century. Men more frequently required to be reminded than informed. And it's as much about rhetoric as it is about human nature. If you start off an argument by having that common ground, by saying, hey, I'm like you in this way, or we know what you want, we can tell you what you want, what you really, really want, then you have a good foundation for reminding them, in Johnson's words, about what it is that you can do, what it is that is going to be helpful for them. Whereas if you start from kind of ground zero, you say, okay, so I have this business and it like sells stuff and it's really cool stuff. I really like it a lot. And here's like, you should totally buy all this stuff because I have a business and it sells stuff. You're gonna have a much harder time making that case. So what you need to do, going back partly to the purpose, is thinking about your audience's goals first. Always write. You always argue with your audience in mind. So what does your reader need to know? What do they want to get out of this transaction, out of this message? What is going to be helpful for them? And you want to use that as kind of a way eventually to get to your goals. So again, in sales, your goal is to make the sale. But you might have to meet other goals first. You might have to say, okay, I need to inform my potential customer, what does this actually do? What are the differences between these products? Why is this going to benefit them and help meet their goals? You might have to convince them that this is a better option than this other product, or you should buy it from us rather than going to Amazon or something like that. Maybe you have to convince them, I am qualified to give you an opinion here to provide this service. I have this much experience. I've done this kind of work before. I can point to these qualifications. And that is going to get you closer to the sale. And so once you meet their needs, then you're able to say, okay, good. Now I've met your needs, you can meet mine, AKA show me the money. This is why we practice by asking for money. So as you are crafting your appeals, we'll look at those in a minute, you want to consider several different variables. What is your relationship to the people involved? If you're writing to your parents, you're probably going to hopefully have a reasonably good, reasonably close relationship with them. But it's also a complicated and intimate relationship in the sense that you know that certain techniques will work with those particular individuals that might not work with the average or the typical parent. And so when I do the asking for money exercise in class, I often have my students read their letters out loud. And oftentimes the letters to the parents are really heavy on the pathos, on the emotion. It's, dear mom and dad, I love you so much. I know you want me to succeed in college, and I want you to be so proud of me as I graduate with honors from Cal State. Now that I've done that, let me tell you why you need $100 to buy this textbook or this parking pass or whatever it is. And it kind of lays it on thick. And I would say that a majority of the letters I've seen to the parents tend to work that way, but not all of them. Sometimes the authors will make a very logical argument and say, here is the specific reason I need this money. Here's exactly what it will accomplish. And here's how this will result in something positive for both of us. And so there's maybe more of an emphasis on logos or reason than you would normally expect. But for those particular people, it would work. Then you want to think of the context. And this is sort of the thing that's obviously all around us, and figuring out how to balance the appeals there. And this is where I bring in another appeal, Kairos. In Greek, this actually means balance, as in a scale. So if you balance the factors that are going to affect your readers right now, in this time and in this place, then you capture the timeliness of the argument. And Writing Commons puts it this way: you attempt to capture words that will be immediately applicable, appropriate, and engaging for a particular audience. And so I have to consider Kairos when I put together my lectures, not just in terms of how they relate to each other, but how they're related to the work you're doing at that point in the quarter. I record these ahead of time. So technically right now it's Thursday the 16th, but this lecture is for the 23rd. By the time you are watching this, you will have done more work. And so I refer to stuff that's kind of going along there. I saw a great meme the other day, and it was commenting on the Kairos of advertising, how we make timely arguments in ads. And it said, before coronavirus, ads just said, buy a Toyota. Now they say, this is a really difficult time, buy a Toyota. Some things maybe don't change that much. Overall, though, Kairos is a dynamic process. So it's kind of hard to pin down. Something that might work really well today is not going to work at all tomorrow. So this is what often prompts revision. It's not just that you have a new audience, but you're talking to them in a different setting, using different methods. I'm giving this lecture on a Zoom video, whereas last quarter I gave it in a live classroom. And even just different cultural references. I learned the importance of this my first year teaching at Ohio State University, where I did my master's and my PhD. As you may know, Ohio State is just slightly obsessed with football. The football players are basically celebrities. At least the fall semester pretty much is organized around the football season. And especially when we get to Michigan week, where Ohio State plays Michigan and everything just gets super, super crazy. Now, when I started at Ohio State, I was not really a football fan. To be honest, I'm not really a football fan now, partly because the college I went to, University of Illinois, well, they did not have a good football team. We would not win a lot of games, and so I learned to pretty much ignore the football team and watch basketball instead. We had a really good basketball team. So I got to Ohio State, and we'd play over the weekends, of course, play football games. And when I had a Monday section, I noticed that my students, if we had won, were kind of happy, energized, a little hungover because they'd been up celebrating. And if we lost, they were depressed, maybe absent, and probably even more hungover because they were drowning their sorrows or lighting couches on fire or doing stuff like that. OSU football fans are a little extreme. And so even though I personally didn't really care about the results of the football games, I found that it helped me connect to my audience if I learned something about that context. And so I would pay attention to who are we playing this weekend. Maybe mention that at the Thursday or the Friday classes. I would take note of how the game had gone because that is going to give me a clue into how my students are likely to react. If we had lost, maybe I don't want to put so much emphasis on class discussion, or I want to find some way to distract them there. And since so much of that culture revolves around football season, that helped. That showed my students, most of whom cared a lot more about football than I did, that this would be a way to engage in that culture and to make it sort of more relevant for them. So it was an element of Kairos that I was able to take advantage of. So what you need here is intimate and specific knowledge of the argument setting and timing. So there's sort of a parallel to audience knowledge here. And the main question is, what argument can you make here and now that you can't make at any other time? If you were to watch, these YouTube videos 3 years from now, hopefully coronavirus will be gone away by that point. Hopefully. But a lot of the references will be dated. And that's going to be an issue in any time you watch something after 6 months or a year or 5 years, especially something like comedy. Everything is topical. And so you have to balance between what's going to be consistently appealing, and that might be funny or touching or relevant to your audience, and what's going to last and what's not. So if you watch, for example, the famous and classic SNL skit, More Cowbell, you'll probably connect to the antics and the energy of the skit, but you might say, wait, who's Blue Oyster Cult and why are they telling us not to fear the Reaper? It's a different culture. Here's one way we might look at this. I did not create this diagram. It's a little busy for my taste, but I like the content it includes. So it points out that we have our main rhetorical appeals. I'll go over those in a minute here. And these form the context. But they also interact with each other. So if we start here with our purpose, what am I trying to accomplish with this message? And then go outside here, we think, in what context am I arguing? Then we can start thinking about how these interact. So if I have a particular speaker, what does that mean for who I can address and how I need to do that? And what does that mean for the message that I can give there? And I'm going to go over the details here because I don't want to go through every bit of it. But these are useful variables to think about when you're analyzing or choosing what to analyze in a particular message. So let me then go over those particular appeals, and I want to show you how they might work in a scientific context. We're going to start with ethos. Ethos is about authority, but it's also about credibility or character. So the same root forms our English word ethics. So we have this sense of kind of moral integrity, but also let's kind of think of characteristics. Nowhere is this more important than in politics, because a given speaker, given politician, does not just stand for an idea, but also represents maybe a party or a particular branch of government or a particular administration. And all of that is tied to how he or she represents himself or herself. Is this a person that the audience trusts? What ideas do they have, fair or unfair, stereotypical or actual, about what this person is like or believes or wants to promote or whatever it is? And how is that going to affect how you receive the message? So a message will be different if it is delivered by the governor versus the president. You may have read that the stimulus checks, the bailout checks, if you get a physical check, will be signed by Donald Trump. And that hasn't happened in previous stimulus checks, but she said that would be an important part that kind of projects a certain image, that it's not just the faceless U.S. government helping you recover from the economic fallout. It is Trump personally. Now, that might be good for some people and bad for some people. I don't think anyone would refuse to cash a $1,200 check just because Trump's name is on it, but they might grumble about it a little bit and say, why do we have to put that stupid name on that stupid check, or I hate him so much. And it transfers over to any context. But we can also think about this in terms of how we establish our own expertise and our own authority. I am teaching this class partly because of sort of the formal marks of expertise and credibility that I have, that I've been teaching for 15 years, that I have a PhD in my case, in English, in writing, that I can have done this particular class before. And that is going to influence how you receive my argument. If you just pull some random person off the street and he starts telling you about how to write papers, you should be asking, well, why should we listen to you? And this is why, for example, a Wikipedia entry is not necessarily quite as reliable as, say, a published journal article. We'll get to those questions later on in this quarter. And so one way we can think about ethos rhetorically is with endorsements. How does somebody say, you should buy this product, and how do they use their credibility to promote that? Is this something that they use themselves? The 9 out of 10 dentists use Crest. See that all the time. I don't know where they find all these 9 out of 10 dentists, but they keep changing their minds. But we also see celebrity endorsements, for good or ill. I'm willing to grant, for example, that probably a professional basketball player will know more about basketball shoes than I do, because they actually use them. They move around on the court, and they presumably use the products that they are endorsing. But celebrities don't just promote those products. They say, hey, I'm a celebrity, so you should listen to me on this political topic. You should vaccinate or not vaccinate your kids, Jenny McCarthy, because I'm a celebrity and I told you to. You should vote for this person or not vote for this person because you can do this. You should drink Sprite or drink Pepsi or drink whatever it is because this is what this person you admire for some reason drinks or eats or whatever it is. And so we have, as with all these appeals, sort of a potentially positive, potentially negative side. These are tools. You can use them badly, you can use them well. You also do this in terms of what's called borrowed credibility. And every time you cite a source, you're transferring some of that source's authority to your own arguments. That might be to show that someone who's really, really smart agrees with you. Or it might be to show that your ideas are comparable to theirs, whether you're agreeing or disagreeing, because that is one way to say, hey, this is important, this is significant, and so this is worth listening to. And we looked at that a little bit in terms of using sources and using evidence lectures earlier this quarter. And that's going to be a big part of setting up, say, a research project we'll get to in paper 2 later on in a few weeks. Logos works a little bit differently. So logos is not the little pictures like the M for McDonald's or the goddess figure for Starbucks. Logos is about logic. So this is a Greek term meaning, among other things, word or logic. And this is about making the argument make sense. Is it reasonable? Is it coherent? So a lot of the stuff I was talking about in terms of evidence in the previous lectures appeals to logos. You see a lot of this in science because we're all about the evidence. But we also, as we'll look at with the Goldacre readings, as we looked at a little bit with Pierce especially, and Diamond to a different extent in our last discussion, this is how you appeal maybe emotionally to an audience. How do you combine, here are some facts, with here's how I want you to interpret them. So you're going to use this to show that your argument holds together, it is coherent, and that it is a reasonable approach. Whether or not your readers agree with you, they should be able to see, okay, I can see where you're going with this. I can see why you would argue that based on these premises and based on that evidence. They can interpret it differently. They can say this doesn't quite work logically, but they can say, I see where you're going there. And that's really the goal of the claims we're making in this class. Make something that is a reasonable interpretation. And it doesn't particularly matter whether I agree with you or your classmates agree with you doing the peer critiques or what it is, because you've shown that you have that logical consistency within your argument. So as I mentioned, a lot of science relies heavily on this. Anytime you see quantitative analysis, this is usually statistical analysis and professional scholarship, or claims about causal relationships, you are appealing to logos. But you do this all the time. I got an email from a student just the other day, and I get these every quarter, saying, I have been sick for a week. I'm really not feeling well. I'm going to the doctor tomorrow. Can I please have an extension on my homework? That is, at least in part, a logical argument. Here's X. I've been sick. Here's why, therefore, I need an extension on the paper. And I did actually give the extension on, in this case, because the argument, it made sense. And finally, we have my favorite, the appeals to pathos. Pathos can be kind of the wild card, because this is appealing to your audience's emotions. And because humans are weird and messy and emotional, this can be somewhat unpredictable, but when it works, it can work really, really, really well. So the key term here is empathy. You want your reader to relate emotionally to you, to your cause, to the things you represent, to the thing you're trying to support. And sometimes that short circuits the whole argument, the whole process. My favorite example of this is an old PSA advertisement, public service announcement. I think it was for the ASPCA or the Humane Society or a group like that. And it had Sarah McLachlan, and it's called Arms of an Angel. And Sarah McLachlan was very good. She was a singer, and she was very good at injecting this huge amounts of passion and emotion into her songs. And so the ASPCA did this commercial where for the entire time, like the first minute or so of the commercial, you see picture after picture of sick and injured and neglected puppies and kittens. And they all look sad, and they're all, all in cages, and maybe they've been abused or neglected, and it's designed to make you feel sorry for them, maybe to get angry at the behavior that led to this. And the whole time, there's this McLachlan song in the background called Arms of an Angel, and I don't remember all the lyrics now, but it heavily trades on this light and kind of sappy, sweet. It's worth looking up on YouTube just for the experience of going through it. And so she sings the song for the first minute or so, and then shows up on screen holding a puppy and says, "Will you be an angel to these animals?" Because nobody's going to say nope at that point. That would just be monstrous. And so you say, "Oh, okay, Sarah McLachlan, I'm going to be an angel to those poor neglected puppies and kittens." Now, was there a logical argument in there? Possibly. Was there an ethos? Well, celebrity endorsement, you could argue that. But the main thing is pathos. It wants you to feel a certain way about that cause. And it wants you to donate money, time, resources to support them. Nonprofits often have to rely on pathos because the services they offer are not often products in kind of the traditional sense. So if you're donating to a charity or a relief organization like the Red Cross or something like that, your benefit is more, I feel good about myself and I'm helping people, unless here's this physical thing that I can show. Maybe it's a tote bag or something like that if you give enough money, or a coffee mug, but not much else. So pathos is helpful there. Now it is easy to overuse pathos, and the McLachlan ad does kind of overuse that. Also think of television shows. Dramas are often based on pathos in some sense to make you care about the characters, but some genres in there deliberately overdo this. Soap operas, telenovelas especially, everything is like at 11 on the pathos scale in a telenovela. And Korean dramas, K-dramas, do this as well. My wife loves K-dramas. My Korean is still very rudimentary, so I can't follow most of the dialogue, but I can sort of watch the action and say, okay, I bet that's her mother, and they're estranged, but she's very sick, and something is going on, and oh no, here's the evil villain that showed up, even just kind of watching how they act and looking at their tone of voice and stuff like that. So if you use pathos well, it can actually overcome weaknesses in your argument. Even if your argument doesn't make sense, even if the person or the organization making that argument is suspect in some way or weak in some way, if your audience feels the right way, then it won't matter. See also political rallies, but that's another soapbox for another time. So as you are engaging these texts, as you are reading and analyzing them, think, when is pathos important here? But also, as I suggested earlier, how does that work? So are there particular emotions that match up well? And what difference do those emotions make? Read a really good response paper on Easter's End that looked at how Jared Diamond both uses fear to appeal to some readers, but also used examples of his kids to kind of appeal to the parents. I think this is the kind of world I want to leave for my children. And those two passages kind of work in different ways, even though they're both using pathos. To finish up here before I get on to the homework for next week, I want to look at an example of this. And this particular blog post is from 2004, but it connects directly to what we've been discussing about the Pierce article on ClimateGate. This is a blog post by Michael Mann, who, as you know from the Pierce article, is one of the key pro-AGW scientists. He produced the hockey stick graph, which is in your textbook, and has kind of been criticized a lot, but also has kind of punched back at a lot of the criticisms. So I want to look at a blog post that he wrote. Switch it over here and get over to the browser. Okay, so I want to highlight some of the rhetorical techniques he uses here. First of all, before we even get to the content, notice that, remember that one of the things that Pierce especially looked at was this distinction between the scientists and the skeptics. And Pierce was very much of the opinion, like Mann is, that only the real science, as Mann puts it, real climate scientists from climate science from climate scientists, is what matters. And we're going to see this a lot in this blog post, this idea of reliable data, tested data versus speculation, or what he calls myth versus fact. So Michael Mann, he's a very well-respected scientist, at least in certain circles. And he has made a career out of exploring data, gathering data, saying this is how this is what this data shows us, particularly things like tree rings. And of course, he works on climate data mostly. So fact is a very important word to him. And he deliberately uses myth to kind of counteract this. So it's not just you're mistaken about these facts or you don't fully understand them. It's if you disagree with him, you're promoting something that is not even worth being considered in the same realm as fact. So we might think of like a classical myth in a fable, or like a Greek myth, or a religious myth, and something like this. So take a look at some of his language here. Numerous myths regarding the so-called hockey stick reconstruction of past temperatures can be found on various non-peer-reviewed websites, internet news groups, and other non-scientific venues. As with Pierce, the source of the data is very important to Mann, and he makes certain rhetorical claims about that. Peer review, as you guys may know, is a process where experts in the field look over conclusions and articles and data and everything and say, is this worth publishing? Is this reliable? Internet news groups don't really exist anymore, but think about Reddit here. It's basically the same context, same concept there. But the scary part is this last term, other non-scientific venues. So if he is the real climate scientist, then this is the source of the myths here. And he goes through and he labels them myth 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4. And I want to look at how he does that. So myth 0, this is the they say part of his argument. They say that evidence for modern human influence on climate rests entirely on the hockey stick reconstruction of northern hemisphere mean temperatures, indicating anomalous late 20th century warmth. Now look at how he describes this. This peculiar suggestion is sometimes found in op-ed pieces, so opinion-based, and other dubious propaganda, despite its transparent absurdity. Tell us how you really feel, Mike. So even though he does go on, as he does in several of these answers, by making claims based on logos and on ethos, on his own authority and on the coherence of his argument, particularly as he links to specific data here, he's going to lead with pathos. He's going to say that these other people, don't listen to them because they're publishing op-ed pieces. They're publishing propaganda. They're making absurd arguments. And so that is going to set up his readers to react a certain way. Now, this is a blog. In general, he's writing to people who already agree with him. And so he's kind of piling on to the opposition here in a way that can actually be effective. So think about an op-ed or a commentary piece here. So it's kind of ironic. He's criticizing op-ed pieces, but he's kind of producing one here. So he goes on to look at this particular kind of evidence. He gives links to one study here, and he's bringing in a lot of the technical language. He's showing his expertise, his ethos here. Likewise, myth 1, this hockey stick reconstruction is based solely on these 2 papers, which he was the lead author for. He's a little more straightforward here. This is patently false. This is nonsense. This is why you can fill in other words there, depending on what kind of mood you're in. But then he goes, again, same pattern. This is wrong. And now he's going to tell you the citations. He's going to show you, look at these specific figures. Look at these references here. Look at this one and this one and this one. We've seen this argument in a lot of other science writing. It's the, you don't have to take my word for it. Look at this, the LeVar Burton technique for those of you of a certain age. To a point, he kind of mellows out in the middle parts of this as it gets into more complex and more theoretical arguments here. But still, his basic argument is, if you think this, then they say, here's why you're wrong. Here's a nice way of saying it. Such claims reflect a lack of awareness of the distinction between regional and large-scale climate change. So maybe you could see this in terms of, all right, I see why you might think it, but let me explain to you why you're misunderstanding this. Whereas up here is like, you're an idiot and you're following propaganda. So, oops, get back here. The more he gets into this article, the more he cites, the more technical he gets, and the more he relies on ethos and logos. But by the time he gets to the end, he's back to the pathos. Remember how Pierce described McIntyre, the Canadian squash playing blogger and data obsessive in his 60s, and Mann is pretty much of the same opinion. So myth 4, he says, is that errors in the hockey stick undermine the conclusion that late 20th century hemispheric warmth is anomalous. He starts off with what we've seen before. This statement embraces at least 2 distinct falsehoods. You're wrong, and you're wrong, and you're wrong, and you're wrong. Now, in this case, he says this is actually an error in fact, a misunderstanding. But as you go through this, look at how he describes his opposition. False claims of the existence of errors in this reconstruction can also be traced back to spurious allegations. Spurious means they don't hold together, made by 2 individuals, McIntyre and McKittrick. McIntyre works in the mining industry while McKittrick is an economist. This is a really important sentence because, as Pierce did when he calls McIntyre a Canadian blogger, squash playing blogger, Mann wants to argue here that McIntyre should not be taken seriously because his ethos doesn't measure up, that he is industrial, oh no, that he makes a living, he makes a paycheck from industry, where McKittrick is not even a climate scientist, he's an economist. Now, McKittrick is a good economist, he knows numbers, and this is data analysis, but he doesn't want to make those claims. Take a look at how he follows this up. The false claims are first made in an article published in a non-scientific journal. Oh no, Social Science, Energy and Environment. This is actually a journal on climate science, but Mann doesn't like this one, so he calls it non-scientists. And later in a separate comment that was rejected by Nature, this is a famous science journal, based on negative appraisals by reviewers and the editor. It goes on this whole long side note about how that works. The rejected criticism, so the implication here is that the people who know better, the real scientists, rejected this, but still this idea has been repeated, posted on the internet, oh no, and promoted in certain other non-peer-reviewed venues in an online opinion piece. So we're back to this problem here of venue, op-ed pieces, dubious propaganda, non-peer-reviewed websites, internet news groups, and other non-scientific venues. It's not just that Mann hates the people involved, he does. It's that he says the places that they publish mean that they're not reliable. So Pathos and logos interact pretty heavily here, as does man's own ethos, his own reliability, his own kind of reputation here. So if you went into this article basically trusting what he said, you're more likely to come across saying, wow, McIntyre and McKittrick are idiots. They're spreading falsehoods. They're spreading propaganda. If you disagreed with him, then you might come across thinking the opposite of that. Even as man emphasizes science and logic and reason, he puts that in emotional context. He wants this to make an emotional impact on his readers by saying these have been discredited in the peer-reviewed scientific literature, the real literature in his view, and that they don't hold up to those scientific standards. And often that's what this comes down to, is what are your standards for reliable evidence, reliable sources? I talked some about that in the last couple of lectures. And how is that going to give you opportunities to bring in more logos or more pathos or more ethos to your claim? So you can see there how all of these are working together. All right, well, I hope you found that information helpful to prepare for our discussion of Goldacre's readings. We'll also take some time during that discussion to look at how he uses ethos, logos, and pathos, so be on the lookout for that. I want to finish up by giving you some info on the week 4 assignments to prepare you for that. For the Tuesday assignments, that will be April 28th. There's a lot of reading to do, and it will take longer, so I want to encourage you to take some time over that weekend and make sure you give yourself plenty of time to work on this. The handout to start with is from the GMU Writing Center called Strategies for Reading Academic Articles. It's pretty short. I recommend taking a look at this before you watch my lecture. The other reading is long. This is by Wakefield and colleagues from, I believe, 1995, 1996. It's called Pervasive Developmental Disorder in Children. This is the article that launched the claims that the MMR vaccine caused autism. So we'll talk, when we get to that, I'll have an opening lecture on that and give you some more context on that as well. If you still don't have the book, I've given you the link to the version on the Lancet. It's a little harder to read because there's literally a stamp in the middle of the page that says redacted. And we'll get to some of that history a little bit later. So go ahead and read those and watch the lecture video on reading and interpreting academic writing. And then we will have a Zoom session. If you're in section 6, we'll meet at 10. If you're in section 5, we'll meet at 2 to discuss the Wakefield article. Read slowly, take lots of good notes, and bring questions. You'll be writing a response paper on this article, but it's difficult, especially if you've never read professional scientific writing before. So give yourself some time there and email me if you have questions as you read. And then that response paper will be due at 11:59 on Tuesday, but you will want to start some material on that before you go to lecture and do the discussions there. So the full instructions for that are on Blackboard. It'll be similar to paper 1. For Thursday the 30th, instead of having a lecture, you're going to meet with me individually to go over your rough draft feedback on major paper 1. So you'll turn in those drafts, I believe, on the 22nd. Between the 22nd and 30th, I will be grading those, giving you preliminary written feedback through Blackboard. And then I'm going to schedule meetings probably for Wednesday and Thursday, the 29th and the 30th. Still working out the mechanism on that so that everyone has time to meet. And these are not long meetings, 5 or 10 minutes. I want to give you a chance to ask any questions you have about the feedback and to kind of summarize what I thought of your rough draft. The Thursday appointments will be during our regular class times. So overall, since I have 2 sections, I'll likely have the 10 to 12 and the 2 to 4 sections open. I'll probably also open up my office hours and do appointments from 4 to 6. So there's going to be plenty of space on Thursday, but also have some on Wednesday, just in case we need those, because we've got 48 students to fit in. That's a lot of meetings to go through in one day. After that meeting, you're going to write and upload your paper 1 progress reports, just a page, by midnight. I want you to address the following questions. What kind of progress have you made so far on paper 1? just go through the rubric, what tasks you've already completed, and what do you need to finish before the final draft deadline. So based on the feedback you've gotten. I want you to tell me what sort of rough draft feedback you got in the peer review and from me. And was any of it particularly surprising or particularly helpful? So keep track of what those people have said about your paper. And what elements of this paper did you find most interesting or productive, and why? Likewise, what did you find most challenging? So this is a project that you can kind of start working on as you get your peer feedback, and certainly keep track of the stuff for question 3 there. That will be helpful, and that will just be due anytime after the meeting on that day. So pro tip, if you have a busy week, you may want to grab a Wednesday appointment slot so you can do the meeting early and have a little more time to work on the progress report, because you'll also be working, of course, on the revisions for paper 1. All right, that's all I have for you for today. We will meet on Zoom to discuss the Goldacre readings and to apply what we've been learning about the rhetorical appeals. I'll see you then.